Mabaster Velketh of the Serani stood before the massive viewing screen in the Confederation Council chamber and watched the small blue planet rotate slowly in the darkness of space Earth. They called it. She had studied the reports for decades now, and she found the species fascinating in the way one might find a particularly aggressive insect. Fascinating, interesting to observe, but ultimately insignificant in the grand scheme of galactic politics. The Serani were an ancient race with purple skin and large dark eyes that could see far beyond the visible spectrum, and they possessed a gift that made them invaluable to the Galactic Confederation. They could feel emotions across vast distances, and their empathic abilities had helped prevent countless wars through careful diplomacy. Velkith had lived for nearly 800 years, and in that time, she had seen species rise and fall like waves upon a shore, and she had watched civilizations crumble and new ones take their place, and through it all her people had served as witnesses and recorders of galactic history. The humans were classified as a developing species in the Confederation archives, and the classification meant they were too primitive for full membership, but too advanced to ignore completely. They had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, and they had established a handful of small colonies on the edges of known space, and they were clever creatures with quick minds and nimble fingers, but they were also fragile and short-lived. A human might live for 80 or 90 years, if they were lucky, and to Velkith, this seemed impossibly brief. Barely enough time to learn the basics of existence before death came calling. How could any species accomplish anything meaningful in such a short span of time? She often wondered. The council chamber doors opened with a soft hiss, and High Admiral Toreth of the Ven entered with his usual confident stride, and his scales gleamed under the artificial lights, and his 4 arms were clasped behind his back in the formal posture of his people. Ambassador Velkith, he said, with a slight bow of his crested head, I trust you have reviewed the latest intelligence reports from the border region. I have, Velkith replied, and she gestured toward the viewing screen where a star map now replaced the image of Earth. The Varath Dominion has mobilized 3 battle fleets, and they appear to be moving toward the Kepler system. The Varath were a nightmare-given form, and they were massive creatures with thick armored hides and multiple limbs, ending in razor-sharp claws, and they had conquered 12 systems through brutal force and psychological warfare. Their method was simple. They would arrive at a planet with overwhelming numbers, and they would broadcast images of previous conquests and the horrors they had inflicted, and most species surrendered immediately rather than face such a fate. There is a human colony in the Kepler system, Toreth said, and his voice carried a note of something that might have been sympathy. Nearly 50,000 of them on Kepler 7. Velketh nodded slowly, and she felt a wave of sadness wash over her as she considered what was about to happen to those humans. The Confederation cannot intervene, she said, and it was not a question, but a statement of fact. Our treaty with the Varath prevents direct military action in unclaimed space. Correct, Toreth confirmed. However, the Council has decided that this event should be documented for the archives, and you have been selected to serve as the official observer. Velkith understood what this meant, and she would be expected to travel to the Kepler system and watch as the Varath destroyed the human colony, and she would record every detail for future generations to study. It was grim work, but it was necessary, and the Confederation needed to understand how species responded to extinction-level threats. When do I depart? She asked. Immediately, Toreth replied. The humans have already been informed of the approaching threat, and they have requested permission to evacuate their civilian population. And the Varath response. Toreth's scales shifted in a pattern that indicated disgust, and he said, They have blockaded the system, and no ships will be allowed to leave, and they want witnesses to their conquest. Velkith closed her eyes for a moment, and she reached out with her empathic senses toward the distant human colony, and even across The vast gulf of space, she could feel something, a faint echo of emotion that surprised her. She expected to feel terror and despair and hopelessness, but instead, she felt something different, and something that took her several moments to identify. It was determination. She opened her eyes and looked at Torath with a puzzled expression, and she said, "The humans are not afraid." "They should be," Torath replied grimly. "The Vorath have never lost a conquest, and they have never shown mercy, and the humans have no chance of victory." Velkith gathered her robes around her, and she walked toward the chamber doors, and she paused at the threshold and turned back to face the High Admiral. "In my 800 years," she said slowly, "I have learned that the universe often surprises us, and perhaps these humans will provide an interesting study before the end." Torath made a sound that might have been a laugh, and he said, "They are soft creatures with fragile bodies and short lives, and what could they possibly do against the Vorath?" Velkith did not answer, because she did not have an answer to give, and she simply walked through the doors and made her way to the docking bay where her ship waited 3 days later. She arrived in the Kepler system, and what she found there would change her understanding of the universe forever. The human military had arrived before her, and they had not come to evacuate their people, but to fight. Velkith stood on the observation deck of her small diplomatic vessel, and she stared at the human fleet that had assembled near Kepler 7, and it was not a large fleet by galactic standards, perhaps 30 ships of various sizes, but there was something about the way they held formation that made her uneasy. She reached out with her empathic abilities, and she touched the minds of the humans aboard those ships, and what she felt made her take a step backward in shock. There was fear there. Yes, but it was buried beneath layers of something else, and something fierce and wild and utterly alien to her experience. These humans knew they were probably going to die, and they had come anyway. Velkith sat down heavily in her command chair, and she whispered to herself, "What manner of creatures are these?" The Vorath fleet would arrive in 72 hours, and the humans were using every moment to prepare their defenses, and Velkith watched them work with growing fascination and growing dread. She had come to document a massacre, but she was beginning to suspect that she might witness something far more significant. She just did not know what that something would be. Velkith had requested permission to board the human carrier ship, and to her surprise, the humans had agreed without hesitation, and they had even seemed pleased by her interest. The carrier was called the USS Defiance, and Velkith thought the name was appropriate, given what these humans were attempting. She walked through the metal corridors, with a human officer named Captain Chen as her guide, and Chen was a small woman with dark hair and sharp eyes, and she moved with the confident efficiency of someone who had spent many years in military service. "We appreciate you being here, Ambassador," Chen said as they walked. "It means something to the crew that the galaxy will know what happened here, regardless of the outcome." Velkith felt a twinge of guilt at those words, because she had come expecting to document a tragedy, and not to honor brave warriors. "Your people know the odds they face," Velkith said carefully. "The Vorath have never been defeated in conquest, and they outnumber your fleet by a factor of 10. Chun smiled, and it was a strange smile that held no humor, and she said, "We know the numbers, Ambassador, but numbers are not everything." They entered a large room that Velkith assumed was the main gathering area for the soldiers, and what she saw there confused her deeply. There were hundreds of humans in the room, and they wore armor and carried weapons, and they were preparing for a battle they would probably not survive, and yet they were laughing. Actual laughter filled the air, along with loud music that pounded through speakers mounted on the walls, and some of the soldiers were dancing while others sat in groups playing games with small pieces of paper. Vel stopped walking, and she stared at the scene before her, and she could not understand what she was seeing. "Are they not aware of what is coming?" she asked Chun. "They know," Chun replied. "This is how humans prepare for battle, and we call it blowing off steam. A young male soldier noticed Velkith standing near the entrance, and he jogged over with a wide grin on his face, and he was perhaps 20 years old by human standards, with bright red hair and freckles scattered across his nose. "Hey, you are that alien ambassador, right?" he said enthusiastically. "I am Private First Class Danny Morrison, and it is really cool that you are here to see this." Velkith looked at the young human, and she reached out with her empathic senses, and she felt his emotions clearly: excitement and nervousness and determination, and underneath it all a thread of fear that he was deliberately ignoring. "Private Morrison," she said slowly, "do you understand that you may die tomorrow?" Danny's grin faltered for just a moment, and then it returned even brighter than before, and he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Everyone dies eventually, Ambassador, and at least this way, my death will mean something, and I will be protecting those colonists down on the planet." Velkith did not know how to respond to such casual acceptance of mortality, and the Serani treasured their long lives above almost everything else. And the idea of willingly walking toward death was incomprehensible to her. "You do not wish to flee?" she asked. "To live and fight another day." Danny laughed, and he said, "There are kids down there, Ambassador, and families, and people who came to this planet hoping for a better life, and if we run and they all die, and I could not live with myself knowing I abandoned them." He was telling the truth, and Velkith could feel it radiating from him like heat from a fire. Captain Chen touched Velkith's arm gently, and she said, "Come, Ambassador, and the briefing is about to begin." They made their way to a raised platform at one end of the room, and the briefing is about to begin. They made their way to a raised platform at one end of the room, and they be at one end of the room. Music stopped and the laughter faded, and hundreds of human faces turned to look at the officers who stood before Thema. Large man with gray hair and a face marked by old scars stepped forward, and Velkith learned that this was General Marcus Stone, and he was the commander of all human forces in the system. "Listen up," Stone said, and his voice was rough and commanding. "In 48 hours, the Varath are going to hit this system with everything they have, and they think they are going to roll over. Use like they have rolled over everyone else." He paused and looked out at the assembled soldiers, and a fierce smile crossed his face. "They are wrong," he continued. "They do not know what we are, and they do not know what we are capable of, and they have never faced humans in battle." A rumble of agreement went through the crowd, and Velkith felt a wave of emotion wash over her that was so intense. It nearly drove her to her knees. These humans were afraid, and they knew many of them would not survive the coming battle, and yet their fear was wrapped in something stronger, a burning resolve that defied all logic and reason. "We are going to make them pay for every inch of ground," Stone said. "We are going to show them that humans do not surrender and humans do not break. And if they want our people, then they will have to go through us first." The soldiers began to cheer, and the sound was deafening in the enclosed space. And Velkith watched as they raised their fists and shouted words she did not understand. Captain Chen leaned close and said, "It is an old battle cry from our history, and it means we will never give up." Velkith looked at the humans around her, and she saw young faces and old faces, and faces marked by fear and determination in equal measure, and she realized that she had completely misunderstood this species. They were not primitive, and they were not insignificant, and they were something far more dangerous. They were a species that had looked at death and decided that some things were worth dying for. Briefing continued with tactical discussions and battle plans, and Velkith listened carefully and took mental notes of everything. When it was over, the soldiers began to prepare their equipment, and many of them took out small writing implements and pieces of paper, and they wrote messages. "What are they doing?" Velkith asked Chun. "Writing letters to their families," Chun replied quietly, "in case they do not come back, and we call it making peace with our mortality." Velkith watched a young woman carefully fold a letter and place it in her armor near. Her heart and the woman's eyes were wet with tears, but her hands were steady. Then, someone began to sing. It started as a single voice, and then others joined in. And soon the entire room was filled with the sound of humans singing together, and the song was old, and it spoke of courage and sacrifice and standing firm. Against impossible odds, Velkith felt tears forming in her own eyes, and she did not know why. She had witnessed countless events in her 800 years of life, but she had never felt anything like this. These humans were going to fight, and many of them were going to die, and they knew it, and they were singing. Anyway, Captain Chun looked at Velkith and said, "This is who we are, Ambassador, and when the universe pushes us, we push back, and we do not stop until we win, or until there is no one left to fight." Velkith looked at the singing soldiers, and she felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized that the Vorath had no idea what they were about to face. Neither did she. The Vorath fleet arrived exactly when expected, and they emerged from faster than light, travel like monsters rising from the depths of an ocean, and their ships were massive black vessels covered in spikes and weapons, and they numbered over 300. Velkith stood on the observation deck of the diplomatic station that had been positioned at a safe distance from the battlefield, as she was joined by observers from 6 other Confederation species who had come to witness the conquest. Admiral Preth of the Volari stood beside her in his insectoid form, clicked nervously as he watched the tactical display, and he said, "This will be over quickly, and the humans should surrender now to minimize casualties." Velkith said nothing because she knew the humans would not surrender, and she had felt their resolve aboard the Defiance, and these were not creatures who would kneel before an enemy. The human fleet moved into position between the Vorath Armada and the planet below, and the 30 human ships looked impossibly small against the wall of black vessels that faced them. "Foolish," muttered Ambassador Crix of the Drell, and his serpentine body coiled tighter around his observation chair. "They should flee and preserve what ships they can, and fighting is pointless." The first shots were fired, and space lit up with energy. Beams and projectiles and explosions that bloomed like deadly flowers. The human ships took damage immediately, and Velkith watched as one of their frigates was torn apart by concentrated fire and debris, scattered across the void, and 300 humans died in an instant. "It has begun," Admiral Preth said grimly. "The humans will break soon, and all species break when faced with such overwhelming force." But the humans did not break. Instead, they pushed forward, and the remaining ships accelerated toward the Vorath fleet, and they fired everything they had, and 2 Vorath cruisers exploded under the concentrated assault. The alien observers fell silent as they watched the impossible unfold before them. "They are advancing," Crix said with confusion in his voice. "Why are they advancing, and do they not see they are outnumbered?" Velkith reached out with her empathic senses, and she touched the minds of the human crews aboard those ships, and what she felt made her gasp aloud. They were terrified, and they were watching their friends die around them, and they knew they were probably next, and yet they kept fighting. The fear was there, but it was not controlling them, and instead, it seemed to fuel them like wood thrown on a fire. Drop pods began launching from the human carriers, and hundreds of small metal capsules shot toward the planet's surface, and the Vorath anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, and the sky above Kepler 7 became a hellscape of explosions. And burning metal. Velkith watched the casualty reports scroll across her display, and 30% of the drop pods were destroyed before reaching the atmosphere, and thousands of humans died in their metal coffins before even reaching the ground. "This is slaughter," Admiral Preth said, and his compound eyes were wide with something that might have been horror. "They must stop, and they must surrender." A transmission came through from the Vorath flagship, and the alien commander appeared on screen, and he was a massive creature with a face full of teeth and 4 small eyes that burned with cruel intelligence. "Humans," the Vorath commander said, "you have lost 30% of your landing force before touching ground, and your fleet is crippled. And you cannot win this battle and surrender now, and we will make your deaths quick." The human response came from General Stone aboard the Defiance, and his face was covered in blood from a wound on his forehead, but his voice was steady and strong. "Go to hell," Stone said simply, and then the transmission ended. The alien observers looked at each other in confusion, and Ambassador Crick said, "What does that mean, and where is this hell he speaks of?" Velkith understood, and she said quietly, "It means no." The drop pods hit the surface of Kepler-7, and the survivors emerged into a storm of enemy fire, and Velkith watched through satellite feeds as human soldiers poured out of their pods and immediately began advancing toward Vorath positions. They did not take cover, and they did not retreat, and they ran forward, screaming battle cries that the microphones barely captured over the sound of weapons fire. "What are they doing?" Admiral Preth whispered. "Why do they not seek defensive positions, and why do they run toward the enemy?" Velkith watched a human squad reach a Vorath fortification, and she saw them engage the massive aliens in close combat, and humans died with every passing second, but they kept fighting. One human soldier was impaled on a Vorath claw, and with his dying breath, he activated an explosive device that killed himself and 3 enemies. "They are insane," Crick said, and his voice was barely a hiss. "This is not how civilized species fight, and this is madness." The battle continued for hours, and the human fleet was reduced to a handful of battered ships, but they refused to withdraw, and they kept firing and kept fighting on the ground. The human soldiers pushed forward through casualties that would have broken any other species, and they took objectives that should have been impossible to capture. Velkith watched it all, and she felt the emotions of thousands of humans washing over her in waves of fear and determination and grief and rage. She saw a young soldier drag a wounded comrade to safety while under fire, and she saw another throw herself on an explosive to save her squad. And she saw humans die protecting each other again and again. "I do not understand," Admiral Preth said, and his voice was small and confused. "They have lost half their forces, and they should have broken by now, and every species breaks at 30% casualties, and it is a law of nature." Velkith looked at the tactical display, and she saw that the Vorath advance had stalled, and she saw confusion in the enemy movements. The Vorath had expected the humans to surrender hours ago, and they had expected the terror tactics that had worked on 12 other species to work again, and they had not prepared for an enemy that simply refused to stop. "The Vorath are hesitating," Velkith said, and the other observers turned to look at her. She pointed at the display and said, "Look at their formation, and they are pulling back, and they do not know what to do." It was true, and the massive Vorath army was reorganizing, and their advance had stopped, and for the first time in the history of their conquests, they faced an enemy that did not behave the way they expected. The humans used that pause to dig in and reinforce their positions, and medics rushed to treat the wounded, and ammunition was distributed, and the survivors prepared for the next assault. Velkith looked at the casualty numbers, and she felt sick, and over 10,000 humans had died in the last 6 hours, and yet the survivors showed no signs of giving up. She reached out with her empathic senses one more time, and she felt something new in the minds of the human soldiers. Hope. They had survived the first wave, and they had made the enemy hesitate, and now they believed they might actually win. Velkith sat down heavily, and she whispered, "What manner of species is this?" No one had an answer. The battle entered its second day, and Velkith had not slept, and she could not look away from the screens that showed her the impossible events unfolding on Kepler-7. The Vorath had regrouped and launched 3 more major assaults, and each time the humans had held their ground, and each time both sides had paid a terrible price in blood. Admiral Preth had stopped making predictions about when the humans would break, and Ambassador Crix had gone completely silent, and the other observers watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. Velf focused her attention on a single human squad that was defending a ridge overlooking one of the main colonial settlements, and the squad had started with 12 soldiers and now only 5 remained. Their leader was a woman named Sergeant Rodriguez, and Velkith had been watching her for hours, and she moved with a calm efficiency that seemed impossible given the chaos. Around here, a wave of Varith warriors crested a nearby hill, and there were at least 50 of them, and they charged toward the human position with claws extended and teeth bared. 5 humans against 50 Varith, and the odds were impossible. Sergeant Rodriguez raised her weapon and said something to her squad that the distant microphones did not catch, and then all 5 humans stood up from their cover and began walking forward, running and not charging, and just walking steadily toward the enemy with their weapons firing. Velth felt her heart pounding in her chest as she watched, and she reached out with her empathic senses and touched the mind of Sergeant Rodriguez. What she found there took her breath away. The sergeant was terrified, and she was exhausted, and she was grieving for the 7 soldiers she had already lost, and underneath all of that was something else. A cold, hard core of absolute refusal. She would not retreat, and she would not surrender, and she would not let those monsters reach the civilians in the settlement behind her, and she would die first. The humans and Varith collided, and the fighting was brutal and close, and Velketh watched as 2 more humans fell, and then a third. Sergeant Rodriguez took a wound to her side that would have been fatal to most species, but she kept fighting, and she kept shooting, and she kept pushing forward. When her weapon ran empty, she drew a blade and continued fighting, and when the blade broke, she used her fists. The Varith began to fall back, and they were not defeated, but they were confused, and they had never encountered prey that fought like this, and their instincts were failing them. Sergeant Rodriguez stood among the bodies of enemies and allies alike, and she was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and she should not have been standing, and yet she raised her fist toward the retreating Varith and screamed something that Velkith could not hear. 2 surviving members of her squad moved to support her, and one of them was little more than a boy with tears streaming down his face, and he was shaking with terror, but he did not run. Why? Velkith whispered to herself. Why do they not stop? She had seen species fight before, and she had seen brave warriors and desperate defenders in last stands, but she had never seen anything like this. The Varith commander broadcast another surrender offer, and this time his voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like respect. Humans, he said, you have fought well, and you have proven your courage, and there is no shame in surrender, and we will honor your warriors if you lay down your weapons. The human response came from General Stone, and he was still aboard the battered remnants of the Defiance in orbit, and his ship was barely functional, and most of his crew was dead. I am going to give you one chance, Stone said, and his voice was quiet and cold. Take your fleet and leave this system and never come back. And if you stay, then we will make you pay for every single life you have taken. The Varith commander laughed, and he said, you are in no position to make threats, and you have lost half your forces, and your fleet is destroyed. Then come and finish the job. Stone replied, but know this, we will fight until the last human falls, and we will make your victory so costly that you will never forget the price. The transmission ended, and the Varith commander was silent for a long moment. Velketh watched the tactical display, and she saw the Varith forces reorganizing for what would surely be the final assault, and there were still over 200 enemy ships in orbit and tens of thousands of ground troops. The humans had perhaps 5,000 soldiers left and 3 functioning ships, and yet Velkith felt something shift in the emotional landscape of the battlefield. Varith were hesitating again. She focused her empathic senses on the enemy forces, and what she felt surprised her. The Varith were afraid not of death, and the Varith did not fear death the way other species did, but they feared something else, and it took Velkith several moments to understand what it was. They feared the humans, these massive armored predators, who had conquered 12 star systems, had looked into the eyes of humanity and seen something that terrified them. The Varth were natural hunters, and they understood prey, and they understood fear, and they understood the desperate flight response that all species share, but the humans had no flight response, and when cornered, they did not run, and they did not surrender, and they, Adakidvaleth, thought about the young soldier who had thrown himself onto an explosive to save his friends. And she thought about Sergeant Rodriguez, standing bloody and broken but still fighting, and she thought about General Stone refusing to flee, even as his ship burned around him. She finally understood humans were not brave, despite their short lives. And they were brave because of them. Every human knew from birth that their time was limited, and they had learned to spend their lives like currency, and when something threatened what they loved, they would pay any price. The Varth had evolved as apex predators, and they had never encountered a species that treated death as acceptable cost, and they had no framework for understanding creatures who would willingly sacrifice themselves for others. They are not going to attack, Valkis said. Suddenly Admiral Preth turned to look at her with confusion on his insectoid face, and he said, "What do you mean? And they have overwhelming force. Look at their formation," Valkis said, and she pointed at the display. "They are pulling their damaged ships to the rear, and they are consolidating their ground forces, and they are not pressing the attack." She was right, and the Varth assault that everyone expected never came, and instead the enemy forces held their positions. And waited. Hours passed, and neither side moved, and the tension on the observation deck grew unbearable. Then the Varth commander broadcast one final message. "Humans," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter and more thoughtful. "We have fought many species, and we have conquered many worlds, and we have never encountered your kind before." He paused, and Velkith could feel the weight of his next words. "We withdraw our claim on this system, and we acknowledge that the price of conquest is too high, and we will remember what we have seen here." The Varth fleet began to move, and they turned away from Kepler 7, and they jumped to faster than light, and they were Gnevelkith, stared at the empty space where the enemy had been, and she could not believe what had just happened. The humans had won. They had faced an enemy 10 times their strength, and they had refused to break, and they had made the Varth fear them. Admiral Preth made a sound that might have been a gasp, and he said, "This is impossible, and the Varth have never retreated, and they have never abandoned the conquest." "They have now," Velkith said quietly. She looked at the casualty reports one more time, and the numbers were staggering, and over 15,000 humans had died in the battle, and countless more were wounded. The price of victory had been terrible, but they had paid it willingly, and that was the most frightening thing of all. Velkith walked among the ruins of the battlefield, and the air still smelled of smoke and blood, and the ground was scarred by weapons fire and explosions. Human soldiers moved through the debris, and they collected their dead with gentle hands and quiet voices, and there was no celebration. Here, despite the impossible victory, she had requested permission to visit the surface, and to her surprise, General Stone had personally approved her request, and he had even sent an escort to ensure her safety. The escort was a young corporal named James Wright, and he walked beside her with the careful movements of someone who had been fighting for days without rest. The general said, "You wanted to understand us," Wright said, and his voice was hoarse. He said, "You had questions." Velkith looked at the young human, and she felt the weight of exhaustion and grief pressing down on him, and yet he stood straight, and his eyes were clear. "I have many questions," she admitted, "but I do not know if I have the right to ask them." Wright gestured toward the battlefield around them, and he said, "You watched us fight, and you watched us die, and you earned the right to ask anything you want." They walked in. Silence for several minutes, and Velkath watched as human medics treated the wounded, and engineers worked to restore power to damaged structures. She saw a soldier sitting alone near a row of bodies covered in white sheets, and the soldier was weeping openly, and no one approached him or tried to stop his grief. Who was he to you? She asked Wright. Corporal Martinez, Wright replied. He lost his entire squad, and they were together since basic training, and they were family. Velkith felt her heart's ache at the raw pain in the young human's voice, and she said, "Your people feel loss deeply. We feel everything deeply." Wright said, "It is who we are." They continued walking until they reached a small hill overlooking the colonial settlement, and from here, Velkith could see the buildings that the humans had fought so hard to protect. Children played in the streets below, and their laughter drifted up on the wind, and parents watched them with eyes that held both joy and lingering fear. "That is why we fight," Wright said, and he pointed toward the settlement. "Those kids down there, and their parents and their grandparents, and every person who came to this planet hoping for something better." Velkith looked at the young human, and she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the battle began. "Why did you not surrender?" She said, "You knew the odds, and you knew you would probably die. Why did you keep fighting?" Wright was quiet for a long moment, and he watched the children playing below, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "Ambassador, there are some things worth more than survival, and some things worth dying for. And those people down there trusted us to protect them, and we made a promise." "A promise?" Velkith repeated. "Every human who puts on a uniform makes a promise." Wright said, "We promise to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them, and we promise to fight when others cannot, and we promise to never abandon those who need us." He turned to look at Velkith, and his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Breaking that promise would be worse than death," he said. "I could not live with myself if I had run away, and I could not look at those children and know that I had abandoned them to save myself." Velkith felt tears forming in her own eyes, and she understood now what she had been witnessing. The humans did not fight because they did not fear death, and they fought because they feared something worse, the shame of failing those who depended on them. "Your species is remarkable," she said softly. Wright shook his head, and he said, "We are not remarkable, and we are just humans, and this is what we do." A voice called out from below, and Velkith saw General Stone climbing the hill toward them, and the old soldier moved slowly. And he was clearly exhausted, but he still carried himself with dignity. "Ambassador Velkith," Stone said as he reached them, "I wanted to thank you for witnessing what happened here, and for recording it for the galaxy." "I did nothing," Velkith replied. "Your people did everything." Stone looked out at the settlement, and he said, "We lost a lot of good soldiers and a lot of good friends, and this victory came at a terrible cost. Do you regret it?" Velkith asked. Stone turned to face her, and his eyes held a depth of pain that made her flinch, but his voice was firm when he spoke. Not for a single moment. He said, "Every soldier who died knew what they were fighting for, and they made choice, and I will honor their sacrifice by rebuilding what we have lost, and by making sure their deaths meant something." Velkith reached out with her empathic senses. One final time, and she touched the minds of the humans around her, the grieving soldiers and the relieved civilians and the exhausted survivors. What she felt was not triumph or pride or satisfaction. It was simply determination. The humans had won this battle, but they knew there would be other threats and other challenges, and they were already preparing to face them. They would mourn their dead and heal their wounded, and then they would stand ready to fight again, because that was who they were. Velkith returned to her ship that evening, and she began composing her report for the Galactic Confederation, and she wrote for hours, and she tried to capture everything she had witnessed. When she finished, she added a final note, a warning to every species in the galaxy. The humans are not the strongest species we have encountered, and they are not the fastest, or the longest-lived, or the most technologically advanced, that they possess something that makes them more dangerous than any of these traits. They have looked at death and decided that some things are worth dying for, and when you threaten what they love, they will not stop, and they will not break, and they will fight until they win, or until every last one of them is gone. My recommendation to the Confederation is simple: do not threaten humanity, and do not attack their homes or their families, and do not give them a reason to fight. Because if you do, they will come for you, and they will not stop until the job is done. Velkith transmitted her report, and she sat back in her chair and she looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Vorath were spreading the word about what had happened at Kepler 7 and other predatory empires were taking note of the small blue world called Earth. And somewhere on a battered colony, a young soldier was writing a letter to the family of a fallen friend, and somewhere a general was planning for the next threat, and somewhere children were playing in streets that should have been conquered. Velkith smiled to herself, and she whispered, "Perhaps the universe needs species like them." And for the first time in 800 years, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time: hope.